All right, welcome to another episode of the Maker's Bar. I'm so excited about our guest today. We are talking to Laurence Girard. He is the CEO and founder of Fruit Street Health, a diabetes prevention program that is delivered via telehealth and live group conferencing with a registered dietitian. So, Laurence, welcome to the show. We're so excited to chat with you today.
Thank you for having me on the show, Jennifer.
This is going to be so much fun. So I want to open this up real quick. I want you to tell us, because I think it's pretty straightforward what you do, but maybe give us a little insight on what Fruit Street Health is and who your targeted audience is.
Yeah, so we're focused on solving a big public health problem, which is prediabetes. And that just means that someone has elevated blood glucose and they have a high risk of developing type 2 diabetes at some point in their life, which can lead to serious health complications like blindness, amputation, stroke, heart disease, dialysis, and other issues. And most people don't realize this, but 1 out of 3 adults in the US are now pre-diabetic, but 8 out of 10 people don't know that they have it, which is a big problem because, again, they could go on to develop type 2 diabetes. And so what we try to do is raise awareness of prediabetes and then enroll people into our digitally delivered diabetes prevention program, which is a 12-month program where people can video conference with a dietitian and group of other people on Zoom, going over topics like diet, exercise, sleep, and stress management. There's 26 classes in a year, and then we issue them a wireless scale so they can track their weight loss progress in the app, a Fitbit or an Apple Watch so they can track physical activity, and then they can take pictures of their food in the app and get feedback from a dietitian. We also have integration with LabCorp for blood testing, as well as a healthy food delivery partner called Modify Health that we're starting to implement. And the goal is to help people lose at least 5% of their weight or reduce their A1C values, which is a measure of blood glucose. And that's basically how we deliver the program. We help people to become healthier. It's based on a government-funded clinical trial that showed that people could reduce their risk for type 2 diabetes by more than half by making these lifestyle changes.
Wow, I love that. Well, and I'm familiar with some of that, so I totally can resonate with what you're saying. So I love that. Thanks for sharing that. So I'd like to know, I guess, a little bit about your backstory. Like what inspired this for you? Because I always feel like as entrepreneurs, we sort of have, something that we're passionate about, and it sort of leads to this evolution of what we're trying to create. So I'd love to know your backstory.
Sure, yeah. So when I was 18, I thought about what I wanted to do with my life, and I decided that I wanted to go to medical school because I really wanted to have a social impact. And so I was going down that route, and I was volunteering in an emergency room while simultaneously taking a nutrition epidemiology course with a Harvard School of Public Health professor. And I realized that I was probably one of the only people that has ever taken a nutrition epidemiology course while working in an emergency room, because they're really polar opposites in healthcare. One is prevention and one is treating things, after they happen. And I started to realize that a lot of the patients coming into the emergency room had preventable conditions like diabetes, heart disease, stroke, obesity, and actually saw several patients that died in the emergency room from, heart disease related to their obesity, for example. And I just became frustrated by that. And I felt like, why are we not doing more as even a local community to do prevention? You had like the grocery store, you had the YMCA locally, and then you had the hospital. And it's like, well, couldn't we have done more to prevent this from happening in the first place? So I became interested in public health. Then I read about a physician named Dr. Dean Ornish who proved you could even reverse advanced stage heart disease through diet and lifestyle. So I got fascinated with his work and basically got interested in public health and prevention. And then the following year, I moved to Boston, and I was in the bachelor's degree program at the Harvard Extension School, which is the division of continuing education. It's usually for older adults, but some regular age college students pursue it. And I ended up there because in high school, I almost played professional soccer. So I had kind of like a non-traditional route to college. But some of my professors at the Harvard Extension School were physicians that started the Institute of Lifestyle Medicine at Harvard Medical School, where they teach physicians how to do these programs with their patients. But I also became interested in entrepreneurship because they had opened the Harvard Innovation Lab on the business school campus. And that was kind of like my first exposure to entrepreneurship aside from watching The Social Network, which I feel like every entrepreneur has watched. But I started to realize that maybe instead of going to medical school, I could have a large impact in public health through technology and entrepreneurship. So it started as a summer project at the Harvard Innovation Lab about 10 years ago.
Well, I want to say I really like your story, and I really like what you're doing in your perspective, just coming from the place of more prevention, right, versus the other side of it, because I think that is so important, and we don't talk about that enough. So I that touched me because I really like that, because that's kind of my stance on things, is how do we prevent things instead of having to clean up things. So I think this is really, really good. But you touched upon something, stepping into this entrepreneur space, right? Like, I feel like sometimes we have this passion and we go into this entrepreneur space, and with that comes challenges, right? And so I always feel like the real talk is what we really need to get into when we're talking to entrepreneurs, is to say, hey, there's the goods and the bads of this, right? Like, we have to go through things and weather challenges. So I would love to know, what were some of the significant challenges you faced in the initial stages of getting this platform up and running?
There's too many to count, but I'll try to highlight a few. You made me think of a quote, which is that a startup is a company that doesn't know what its product is or who its customers are. And I think that's very much how Fruit Street started. It was just like this idea that we can make people healthier through technology. And we had many different iterations of the product over time. For example, the original product was a telemedicine software product that we would license to dietitians to use with their existing patients in their practice. So they would pay us $200 per month for the software. And we did that for 4 years, from 2014 up until 2018. And the revenue slowly grew, but it really didn't explode with growth. And ultimately that had to do with things like the dietitians couldn't get reimbursed by insurance, and they couldn't necessarily market to the patients effectively to build up a large patient roster. And so we ended up pivoting the entire business model. And instead of selling to dietitians, we started employing them and then delivering this diabetes prevention program to large self-insured employers and health plans. We've delivered the program to employers like Walgreens, Delta Airlines, Care First, which is a Blue Cross Blue Shield plan. And so our customers basically became our employees, which is very counterintuitive. But I think that that's very common, especially for first-time entrepreneurs, that they don't really know what the product is or who their customers are. And I think sometimes that's the hardest part of, what to figure out. But that's one of, probably 100 challenges that have been faced over 10 years.
Yeah. I have this mentor, and he's always, he says that if you don't have a fire burning in an area, then you're probably not doing your business, right? Like, there's always something a challenge you've got to face. And I think that's what makes, entrepreneurship so fun. It's complex, right? Like, you've always got something going on that you have to solve. But I think on the flip side of that are all the gratifying moments that we get from it. So I would love to, what's been maybe one of the most satisfying moments that you've had in this journey?
Yeah, well, there's this document I like sharing with people, which is a 86-page document that has just patient testimonials. We do something called Wednesday Wins, where the dietitians will share some frontline success stories, and you just have all of these incredible stories of patients that have done things like, lost 50 pounds, or gone to their doctor and been able to stop taking 5 medications, or they've reversed their prediabetes or their type 2 diabetes, or just improved their cholesterol, or they just feel better, as well. And that's kind of, why we even started the company in the first place. We actually started it as a public benefit corporation, which is a for-profit company, but we're more focused on social impact than the average, for-profit company is. And I think that sometimes in entrepreneurship, you can get distracted with, the startup culture of how much money did you raise and at what valuation, and when are we gonna have an exit, versus well, why did we even do this in the first place, which was to improve people's health. And I think it's sometimes easy to lose sight of, the mission of the company. But if you kind of stick with everything you're doing is based on the mission of the company, then I think it makes it more, rewarding than thinking about the financial metrics constantly, which are important for the sustainability of the business. But it's not, I don't think some entrepreneurs perhaps are financially driven, but I think the more successful ones are doing everything from well, what's my social mission? And then obviously I need to have a sustainable business model to scale that.
Yeah. Yeah. And what I'm hearing you say is really just purposing on your why, right? Like focusing in on, what am I saying? Focusing in on your why from the beginning. And when we stay true to that, the other pieces kind of fall into place, right? Like it's like you have to pay attention to the numbers and the ROI and all the things. But if that becomes your sole purpose, then you kind of lose sight of what you're really doing with the business, right? Is that what I'm hearing you say?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think that if you're going to work on a company, you're often making a 10-year commitment to
Yeah.
doing something. And if you're just focused on money, I mean, frankly, I think there's better ways to make money than starting a company. Actually,
Yeah.
I'm reading this book for a class I'm taking right now. It's Founder's Dilemma, and there's some statistics in there that says actually statistically as a whole, you could probably make more money, just, I don't know, becoming a lawyer or something, right? But because there's a lot of failure rate in startups, right? So like, I don't think that, just wanting to make money is necessarily the best motivation. Because you have to like really enjoy this over the course of 10 years. I was also reading about the story of Airbnb, where there were some like brothers in Germany, I think, that copied them, and like Airbnb lasted much longer because they felt these copycat, players are never going to sustain working on the company as long as, we did. And so Airbnb decided not to acquire that copycat competitor. So I feel like part of entrepreneurship is like endurance. And I think the failure rate of startups is not necessarily because the actual business concept failed. It's because the founders gave up because they didn't have the endurance to work on it. Because maybe, it could be that they weren't, it depends on the circumstances. It could be that, they just lost energy to work on the idea, or it could be other reasons as well. But I feel like you have to like love working on it so much that even if you lost all of your funding, lost all of your revenue, and like had to like start over from scratch, that you potentially would at least consider, doing that.
Yeah, I agree with you. All of that. I could just, yeah, mic drop, right? That's so good. So good. So another question I want to ask you is, what are the key values that your company represents, and how do you ensure they're upheld? I love this question.
Yeah. Well, I think in terms of healthcare products, specifically, a good way of approaching it is just think about the quadruple aim of healthcare, which is to improve outcomes with patients, reduce costs for the healthcare system, improve the patient satisfaction with the service, and then also improve the satisfaction of the healthcare provider, which in our case is essentially the registered dietitian. And I think that's a good way of thinking about the actual service. But I think that there's also a different component to it, which is you have these different stakeholders as a business, which are stakeholders such as the employees, the investors, and the customers. And I think Jack Ma from Alibaba put it in a particular order. I believe his order was employees first, then customers, then investors. And I think that sometimes certain investors that I've interacted with have lost sight of that, where they're just like looking at the P&L and the balance sheet. But what about, what is the actual well-being of the employees that are driving these numbers? And I find that with smaller companies, some investors even lose sight of the fact that there are people aside from the founder working on the company, and I think that early stage entrepreneurs, like when they're, let's just say like you have a 22-year-old entrepreneur, like I was when I started, they think about, I'm going to build a product and sell it to customers. Yeah, you need to do that. But the next step is, how do you build a company? And which means a group of people that like their jobs, right, that are happy, and there's a good corporate culture, and that they're delivering the service. And so I think like product building and company building are completely different, and you have to build a workplace that people like ultimately to scale a startup. So
yeah,
so I think it's difficult. You just have to constantly monitor these things,
Yeah, I think it goes back to what we were talking about, the complexity of being an entrepreneur and running a business, right? There are all these facets, but I think it's really good that you said, taking care of the employees, because I think that is probably the most essential thing you can do, because when your employees are happy people, they're delivering to your customers and they're creating an experience for those clients. And so it's important, which leads me to the next question I want to bring up, and how you foster innovation within the company and creativity. I think that that's important. Like, is that through this culture, or are there other things that you're implementing?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's different phases of a company. Like in the beginning, I think you want it to be super innovative and creative because you are that company that doesn't know what its product is or who its customers are necessarily. But I think then you get to another point where it almost just completely shifts. And now it's about scaling. And sometimes I feel like the leader that's the founder in the beginning, figuring out the product, is not necessarily the same leader that's going to scale the company. And it doesn't mean that you have to fire the CEO. It just means that you might need to like bring in a chief operations officer. And sometimes I feel that startups are almost, I mean, everybody wants to talk about like innovation and creativity, but like at some point you say, well, we have a product that's generating whatever it is, 50,000 or 100,000 a month of revenue. And now it becomes like, I feel like it should become less like a startup and more like a rigorous business where you want like a steady captain that's like, growing. But I think in the beginning it's different. And I guess the most beneficial way to kind of think about innovation is I feel like number one, you have to talk to customers, very like Y Combinator style. Like if you're not talking to them, you're just kind of in your head, right? So you can come up with the most innovative ideas in the world, but if you don't validate it with a customer, it's really meaningless. And then I guess the second point would be to think about like what you think is absolutely true and try to prove it wrong. There's that like Mark Twain quote, which is like, it's not what you don't know that'll kill you. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so. And you can spend like years, and this is an entrepreneur, thinking something is true and it's actually not. So you have to question your, assumptions as well.
That's good. That's good. Thank you for sharing that. And I agree with you on that. I do think there are times that you have to work, on scaling, and there are times, and it's not always the same people that bring you to each level. You have to find different people and where their gift sets are. So I want to kind of switch this to you a little bit, come away from the company and talk to you as the entrepreneur, because I think this is probably my favorite part of the questions. And so how do you define success for yourself or for your business? You can say your business, but how do you define success in general?
Yeah. Well, I think entrepreneurs have this big problem, which is that they basically make their identity the business, especially if it's like I think this is with younger entrepreneurs more frequently if they're maybe starting it, in college, and they just kind of like, this is my success or failure as a person is based on the success or failure of my company, and that's just not the correct way of looking at entrepreneurship, because 9 out of 10 startups do fail, right? And I feel like founders know that, but they think, oh, this doesn't apply to me, right? And I think that you need to go into entrepreneurship as a founder or as an investor, realizing that, yes, 9 out of 10 startups fail. And if you're going to work on a startup, you're going to invest in a startup, you should expect that it is going to fail, because statistically that is true, right? And so I think the question becomes, well, did you do the best that you could do as like a leader and a person? Were you acting like ethically and with integrity and, trying to do the best, like exercising your fiduciary responsibility as an officer and director of a company, and really doing your best, but, not to conflate like your value as a human being with the success of your startup, because honestly, a lot of startup success can actually have to do with luck as well, or timing, right? It's not this merit-based thing where like we're all, on a treadmill running a marathon and we're training and training and training, and it's like very merit-based, right? Versus, there could be market factors. There could be a global pandemic. There could be, the interest rates changing. I mean, so I think that to think that in business, everything is within your control and everything is just purely merit-based is just wrong. And I think that it kind of hurts the mental health of founders to think that like, the success of the company is like my value as a person, which is one of their biggest mistakes. So I think it's more about like, our CFO and attorney always says like grade yourself kind of thing, but don't base like your skill and ability or what you've contributed based on the outcome. It's like, did you make the best decisions you could kind of at the time as well? And then also I think like if you can get to a certain level of success, I mean, I like to judge it by, well, yeah, we want to be financially successful so it's sustainable, but like how many cases of type 2 diabetes did you present? Like what was the mission for the user of the product, rather than just saying, oh, we had an exit, for example? I mean, it's an interesting question to say, like, let's just take an example, Babylon Health, this big telemedicine company that, was publicly traded, I think had a multi-billion-dollar valuation, just went completely bankrupt. I mean, financially, yeah, I mean, I guess they failed, but I mean, they probably did impact, hundreds of thousands or millions of patients in a potentially good way. It probably saved a few lives. I mean, is that failure or success, right? Is the main metric of a business succeeding finances, or is it supposed to have some other like societal benefit, even if it, fails financially?
Right. Yeah, I think the question we asked, to what extent did it fail, right? Because I think it's in the how we perceive it, right? The metric that we place for success. But I really like that you mentioned the separating the identity, like moving the entrepreneur away from the business and not defining the success of the entrepreneur by the success of the business. So I think that is important, because we do a lot of times we put these metrics on. It's like, if we don't meet the metric, then we identify that failure as like the bad human, right? Like we're the bad person because we made the bad mistake, or the deal we were doing didn't succeed the way we want it to succeed. So I think that's good. I think that's great advice. So thank you. Another question I want to ask you is, how do you handle adversity when it pops up? Which we know as an entrepreneur, it's all the time.
Yeah. Well, I think the way I handle adversity has changed over the last 10 years. I mean, when I started Fruit Street, it started out as a different company where I had raised about $1 million. And I mean, basically there was a co-founder dispute, and, some of the investors wanted me to be fired. It was a minority of the investors, but it was just kind of like, a mess, I guess, at the time. And it was unclear if I had actually been fired or not based on the cap table, but I said, okay, go ahead, fine, I've been fired, right? But then I said, well, what do I really want to do here? And I said, I still think the idea has a lot of merit from like a social impact perspective. And I think the key word is resiliency. I was resilient and decided to move forward. And I offered all of the old investors free shares in the new company to be ethical and make sure they got a return on investment. And the old company failed, as I had predicted, because they were, whenever you fire the founder, it doesn't usually work so well. But I was resilient. And I think like resiliency is a key thing. And again, it's kind of getting back to grading yourself. Like, do you think that in the face of adversity that you can be resilient and kind of move forward productively, rather than listening to what advisors are saying, or like, I mean, you should take into account what they're saying, but it's kind of like, what do you think? And I think part of being a leader is, what do you think? Not what does 5 people think and you're just going to do whatever they say. It's like, what do you think as a leader? Because if you're going to be the CEO and founder, you're there because you're supposed to have an opinion about like what you should do going forward. I mean, I just finished this 9-month program through Harvard Business School called the Program for Leadership Development. And the whole case study style is you put yourself as the protagonist in a business situation. You say like, what would you do in that situation? And so I think that good leaders that face adversity, they have to like think about like, well, what should I do, rather than facing, really just asking other people what they think. And I think that when you face adversity, you want to do it with grace. Like you want to always be like polite to people, respectful to people, act with integrity, and really just form your own opinion rather than relying on the opinions of others. Because I think so often entrepreneurs have advisors and they ask their lawyer what they should do. They ask their investor what they should do. But you have to form your own opinion at the end of the day if you're going to be a leader of a company, but you should do it with like grace and integrity, I suppose. Yeah.
That's really good leadership advice. And I think that's so true, because a lot of times, especially, I always say leadership is one of those things, like you can't really teach leadership, right? Like you sort of have to work your way in it. The more experience that you get and the more opportunity that you get to rise up as a leader, you develop, right? And so, I mean, they say there are natural born leaders, but I do think leadership is a developed and cultivated thing. And so when you talk about like that inner dialogue, I guess maybe is what we have, that inner voice that we have to be able to come back and center and say, okay, this is the vision of my company and where I'm going, right? And know what you're standing for and what your purpose and mission, and listen to the people around you, but also know that your voice matters, that you are the leader of the company.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's so easy to just go to a lawyer, go to an advisor, go to an investor, go to a spouse, and just say, what should I do? And then you just do whatever the majority of those people say. But I don't think that's really true leadership. It's about forming your own opinion based on almost like an academic view of it. Like, well, what do I really think for myself? Because if you can't form your own opinion as a leader, you really shouldn't be one, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you're in charge. Like, what do you think is the right thing to do?
It's good. That's good. What do you feel like? I want to ask you this question because I think it's fun. What do you feel like you've learned about yourself in this journey? I don't know if this was even on the questions I sent you, but I like this question. What do you feel like you have learned about you in this journey?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that like my view of entrepreneurship has just changed over time. I mean, I think that, when I started doing all of this, it was like a year or two after the Social Network movie came out, and like entrepreneurship was the cool thing to do. And everybody wanted to build like $1 billion technology startup and be like the next Facebook or whatever. But like, I guess I don't necessarily view it that way anymore. I think entrepreneurship is a way to have an impact in the world and like create some wealth, even on a small scale. Like everything doesn't have to become $1 billion company. Somebody that doesn't start out with wealth could create a small business, earn $100,000 a month of revenue, and have an amazing life, right? And I think that there's been this like startup culture where like we have to make $1 billion companies, and I don't know that that's necessarily the case. And I think that there's maybe like a new way of approaching entrepreneurship where everything is not about making $1 billion company. It could just be like a sustainable business. And I guess part of me has actually grown to dislike entrepreneurship partially because I don't like this part of the culture of like everything's going to be $1 billion company and everything's about like these venture capital firms, blah, 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 blah. Things can be on a smaller scale and have an impact and, benefit like founders and employees and still deliver like decent returns to investors at the end of the day. But I think that, I don't know, I part of me loves entrepreneurship and part of me is like, there's parts of it where I feel like it should be done, differently, where it's just a little more, I'm very, you probably tell I'm a little anti-venture capital and private equity. Like our company had 500 physicians that invested in the company, and they invested with this idea of, we can improve public health and healthcare. And I feel like the thing I don't like about entrepreneurship as a whole is that I feel like in the US it's become very focused on, we're going to make money, we're going to have an exit. But like, what about like the days of like, JFK as a leader or like Martin Luther King? Like, well, why are we even doing these projects? And there's been like a sense of, I feel like we're misguided almost like as a country where like everything's about making money. And it's like, well, like, what are we trying to actually improve in the society rather than just having an exit? And so I feel like that's what I don't like about it, that I wish would change a little bit.
Yeah, understood. Well, where do you see kind of, I guess, the long-term vision of this company going for you?
Yeah, well, I think that the diabetes prevention program is such an important public health program. The history of it goes back to a Medicare-funded clinical trial where they spent $175 million and they compared a drug called metformin to this lifestyle modification program. And they basically found that this lifestyle modification program resulted in a 58% reduced risk for type 2 diabetes. And in people over 60, it was a reduced risk by 71%. So that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine. It led to Medicare and Medicaid paying for the program, as well as employers and health insurance companies. And then the CDC built a national public health program where there's now 1,600 organizations delivering this program. Most of them are in person at churches, hospitals, YMCAs, and then some are delivered online like us. And I think that one of the big problems facing the US healthcare system is prediabetes, diabetes, obesity. We're now at a 44% obesity rate. And so when you think about, well, how do you fix healthcare in America? You really can't fix it without fixing diabetes and obesity and lifestyle related diseases, which is why the White House had the first conference on hunger, nutrition, and health for the first time last year that I attended. And I listened to like senators, Republican and Democrat, speak about these issues, and got a cool photo with Senator Booker from New Jersey. So that was fun. But I saw just like this interest at the government level, even in like, how do we fix diet related diseases? And I think it's even beyond health. It's kind of like if you're trying to build a society where people can be happy and healthy, and you need to address like their underlying health, right? And I feel like we want to so often fix everything with a pill. Now you have like Ozempic and all these GLP-1 drugs, and you can't put the whole country on these drugs. And so ultimately, I think the diabetes prevention program and Fruit Street specifically has a potential to say, well, could we enroll, 1 million people or into this program, which means that you are preventing diabetes, you're preventing amputation, blindness, heart disease, stroke, dialysis, mean, we have thousands of preventable amputations every year in the US that are because of diabetes. So I think that Fruit Street and the other national diabetes prevention program providers that we view as partners can really help to, move our healthcare system in the right direction, which is prevention and wellness, rather than just everything being about a pharmaceutical-based approach.
It's good.
Yeah.
It's good. I like it. All right. So one last question I want to ask you. What advice would you lend to a budding entrepreneur that is starting out? You've said a lot of really good stuff here. If they listen to it, I think there's a lot of tips you've already touched upon, but any final words you want to impart on a new entrepreneur?
Yeah. I think there's this like widespread myth that business school is not a valuable thing for entrepreneurs to do. And I couldn't disagree more, even though I previously probably did agree with that. I mean, Y Combinator's great or whatever. And like is it like the Peter Thiel Fellowship where he pays people $100,000 to drop out. But the thing is that like business at the end of the day is science and math, right? And being an educated person is going to make you a better leader. And I'm not saying that entrepreneurs necessarily need to do a 2-year MBA program, because I didn't do that. I did more of like an executive education, program. But there are resources like this program I did through Harvard Business School called the Program for Leadership Development. I would check that out. Or there are other, online executive education programs. I mean, even just like if you were to survey a bunch of 20-year-old entrepreneurs, a lot of them don't know how to read a balance sheet. They don't know how to read, a P&L. They don't really have the legal knowledge. They may not even know how to like run payroll properly, right? So like, I think that entrepreneurship, like medicine and like other careers, should be something where you're doing lifelong learning. And I don't think you have to like drop out of college. I think they, like in hindsight, I took some time off from school in undergrad. In hindsight, I would have worked on my startup while continuing my education, because I think they're actually complementary. And I don't think you have to like drop out of school or stop being educated to pursue entrepreneurship. You can do both. And I think they are complementary. So I would just encourage people to, continue their education, and even, look at like executive education programs and that kind of thing. Because I think they actually can give you a really good foundation that I think is actually necessary to become the type of leader that people want to become. So.
Yeah, that's good. And I would agree with you on that as well. I think leadership is all about continuing to grow, and whatever you pursue, whether that's going back to college or doing courses at home, however you do that, I do think that you have to continue to expand your knowledge. It makes you better in all areas, communicating and dealing with all aspects of the entrepreneurial and leadership journey. So this has been great. Thank you so much. So I do want to ask you, if the audience wants to check out Fruit Street Health, learn a little bit more about what you're doing. I love what you're doing, by the way. I think it's amazing. And I commend you on your dedication, continuing to pursue this and in your bigger mission and calling and why you're doing this. But if they want to get in touch with you and learn a little bit more about the company, do you have a website you want us to send them to?
Yeah, you can just go to fruitstreet.com. You can also find me on LinkedIn as well, and I will definitely respond.
Okay, perfect. Well, this has been great. Thank you so much for all of your knowledge and what you're doing in the health field and helping people live better lives. We appreciate you.
Thank you for having me on the show.
It's been fun. It's been great. Thank you.